This is Kitco News special coverage of the Pacific Bitcoin Festival in Los Angeles, California.
Welcome back. I'm Michelle Makori, and we are continuing our conversation with economist Peter St Onge at the Pacific Bitcoin Conference in Santa Monica. All right, Peter, I now want to focus on de-dollarization and the bifurcation of the global monetary system, because that was a big trend earlier this year. There was a lot of talk about countries doing trade in their own dollars, certainly amongst the BRICS, and moving away from the dollar subsequent to its weaponization following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was a lot of build-up about de-dollarization, especially ahead of the BRICS summit that took place in August in South Africa. There was speculation that at that summit, there would be some kind of movement towards a common BRICS currency, potentially backed by commodities. That didn't happen, still reportedly on the agenda, but that didn't happen. There was a vow to continue to trade with local currencies and move away from the dollar. But significantly, there was a big expansion of the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, adding another 6 members: Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Argentina, Egypt, Iran, and Ethiopia. So where are we now in terms of de-dollarization? Is that trend accelerating, subsiding, or pretty much staying the same?
Yeah, there's been a lot happening in the sort of BRICS space. So essentially every year when BRICS has their conference, they have these summits that involve some of the larger economies that are relatively hostile to the US or to the dollar. And essentially every year it's almost become a tradition where namely it's the Russian embassy in Kenya, which is fairly random, and they'll leak some plan to bring in some sort of gold-backed BRICS currency. So maybe it'll be some sort of external trade rail that will replace the dollar, something like that. So because they've done this a couple times and it doesn't happen, this time they did it again and everybody said, yeah, Russian embassy in Kenya. And indeed, that turned out to not have any legs to it. But I think the reason why BRICS is getting a lot of chatter is because, as you mentioned earlier, there are all these countries who, just joined BRICS. There are something like 36 other countries that have expressed interest in joining BRICS. Just the countries that just joined just a couple months ago, they're roughly the economy of South America. I mean, these are large chunks of the world economy that is pulling out of the dollar sphere and is opening up to joining this. Really, it's a China-led sort of alternative sphere. And I think that what has been driving that this year, there are a couple things that are driving it. The main one has just been the politicization by the US of the dollar. So even during the Cold War,
as many would say.
Absolutely weaponization. Even during the Cold War, we had hot proxy wars all over the world between the Soviet Union and the US, and never ever touched the Soviet central bank's sovereign dollars, because we were run by adults who understood that the most important thing to remaining the world's reserve currency is that you want everybody to use it, yes, even your enemies, because there are very important network effects to making sure everybody's using it. That has now been tossed. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US seized about 400 billion in Russian central bank dollars. Relative to Russia's economy, that would be the equivalent to about 4 trillion in the US. That was a chunk of change. That was massive. And the reason they did that was to try to set off a bank run in Russia. So yes, of course, Mr. Putin's war was unjustified. However, the point here is that a much larger priority for the American people is keeping the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world, because there are several times more dollars in existence than Americans actually use. All right, so after, 70 years or 80 years of reserve currency status, most dollars are held outside the US. Yeah. So they're held by central banks, they're held by rich foreigners. If you are a millionaire in Mexico, your cash is not in pesos. You've been down that road too many times, okay? Your cash is mostly in US dollars, you have a little bit of pesos for day-to-day use. So there are these enormous tens of trillions potentially. Nobody knows, by the way, the Fed studies, they don't know. There are potentially tens of trillions of US dollars hiding out all over the world. These are held, Japanese banks hold treasuries. pretty much everybody in the world uses the dollar. If the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency, all of those tens of trillions come flooding back. And the only people in the world who are actually obligated by law to use the US dollar are American citizens, legal tender laws. So if that were to happen, it would be absolutely catastrophic for the US. So with all of this understanding, for 80 years now, there had been in the federal government a very strong appreciation of the fact that you do not screw with the dollar. Yeah. That you keep off the table. They broke that. And that put a lot of countries on notice. The president of Indonesia, there was an ASEAN meeting where he literally said, look at what happened to Russia. Yeah. Now, Indonesia has been a US ally for a long time. They have not this is not Iran. So for countries of that scale and of that friendliness level to be flirting with this now, I think that is a huge concern. And indeed, if we see this recent round of BRICS additions, we had Argentina in there. That's a longstanding US ally. We had Saudi Arabia. That's the linchpin of the so-called petrodollar system. I think that really the adults who used to run dollar-related US policy have lost the plot. Countries are now peeling off. They're at an absolute minimum. They're realizing that the US dollar is a risky asset to hold. Right? Most countries don't invade their neighbors, but the problem is maybe the US won't like your social policy. Yeah. If you're Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of points of friction on, for example, LGBT policy. Maybe the US won't like your environmental policy. Right? There's a whole range of policies where especially a socially conservative country such as Uganda or Saudi Arabia, somewhere like that, could really feel backed into a corner. And that starts to get them thinking about what happened to Russia. So if the activists who do get a hearing with Joe Biden or with his handlers, if they turn against your country because of some policy reason, well, at that point, are you going to get the bank run? Okay, is your economy going to get crushed? And so that introduces a risk to the US dollar that does not exist with the Japanese yen or the euro, or, in theory, by diversifying out to, in this case, different BRICS members, right? So they're sort of hedging their bets because the US dollar got dangerous.
So less of an idea of moving fully away from the dollar, just diversifying, because at the end of the day, the US dollar still is the king of global reserve currencies. It's still maintaining its value compared to all of the other currencies. But just not putting all your eggs in the dollar basket is what you're saying. That's exactly what's happening so far. And, of course, the reason why the US dollar is the reserve currency is because the transaction costs are so much lower. Right? So if you're a Japanese bank and you need to move billions of dollars around, if you try to do it in a small currency, the Egyptian pound, you're going to lose a big chunk of it. That's not the only reason why the United States is the global reserve currency. I mean, we had Bretton Woods. We had the U.S. demonstrating its military might during 2 world wars that have made it, so it's not just about the transaction speed. They bought it through those things. Really, the biggest reason... the petrodollar as well. The fact that there was an agreement to price oil in dollars is also maintained the status. Yeah, absolutely. Right. The U.S. got it really... First off, the U.S. was the biggest economy at the time. So in the wake of World War II, pretty much the entire world was flattened. And U.S. GDP was actually close to half of world GDP. So that was kind of a freebie. Also, the U.S. had relatively conservative monetary policy. Right? So that was pre-Nixon. You could still trade dollars for gold, unlike any other currency. Right? Every other currency was sort of pyramided on top of dollars. So we got it kind of the old-fashioned way, the honest way. We had relatively, good monetary policy. It was, the dollar of the 1960s was a marvel to behold. We deserved reserve currency status. Since then, that's really when it's been decaying. Now, you can hold on for a long time, even after the fundamentals are not there. The Fed is not that bad. It's kind of a regular central bank now in terms of, certainly not a gold-backed currency. But the Fed's not that bad. The U.S. in general has not been that bad. And so that's why the dollar, I think, has been holding on to its reserve currency. So it earned it impressively in the early days. At this point, it's kind of running on fumes, sustained by the enormous network effects from the transaction costs. The transaction costs are low because the U.S. had gotten it earlier. Now, a side thing with the U.S. dollar, and that's really a big deal at the moment,
is that whatever the reserve currency is, whether it's good or bad, it's going to pick up a bunch of extra demand in hard times, right? So in the 2008 crisis, for example, the crisis came from the US. Like the phone call was inside the house in terms of the US dollar, and yet the dollar soared, right? And, there were a lot of Europeans at the time grumbling about this. Like, wait a minute, you break the world and then our currency suffers? But this is the way reserve currencies work. So at this point, we're kind of in an interesting spot where a lot of countries are trying to diversify out of the dollar. They're diversifying into anything: gold, hard assets, even the Japanese yen and the euro. So countries are essentially at least trying to spread their bets, and yet the US dollar is skyrocketing, right? So you get people who say de-dollarization, look at this thing. Okay, but you have to control for what's happening in the global economy right now, which is that China is in a mess. Europe is barely growing. Essentially, the entire world is in distress. That sends trillions of dollars or trillions in wealth into the US
And we've
dollars.
seen record gold purchases by central bank. I mean,
Yes.
China's central bank just bought gold for the 10th month in a row in August, adding 29 tons to its reserves. And this is what they're telling us. This is what they're reporting, right? And at the same time, it's cut its holdings of U.S. Treasuries to the lowest level since 2009.
Yes.
So we're seeing that trend. And again, that's why there was this thought that we're going to get some kind of gold-backed currency, or backed by a basket of commodities, including gold. That was where this idea was gaining traction from. Is it still a possibility? I mean, can we still say that there could be a common BRICS currency backed by gold, or has the expansion of the bloc made it more challenging to reach consensus? I mean, Jim O'Neill, who came up with the term BRICS, he says you can't even get India and China in the same room. So the idea that they would commit to a shared currency and abandon their own domestic monetary policy is just kind of crazy. That's what he's been saying recently. So BRICS expansion, although obviously India and China were the original members, but do you see the likelihood of this common currency increased or decreased now?
Right, so the key is anything coming from BRICS is not going to look like a euro. Okay, it's not going to be where they all pool together and have a daily use currency. I think the only way that BRICS can possibly get to a common currency is if it's this external US dollar rail, right? So like China today, for example, China uses the US dollar as a trade rail, but they don't use it at home, right? So Chinese are using yuan, right? And they like that because that means that they can have a cheap currency, right? So then they can have cheap exports. So China does not want a strong yuan. Really, no country in the world wants a strong currency at this point. They actually compete to try to make it cheaper so they can steal export market share. So for sure, it is not going to look like a euro. It is not going to be all this ragtag bunch of losers getting together and combining their crappy currencies. And part of the reason is because their currencies are crappy. Brazil has had hyperinflation how many times in my lifetime?
That's where the commodity back comes into play.
That's exactly it, right. And so you could commodity back it, and then people might trust it. It would take a while. People would have to test it. They'd have to see, they'd have to bring their BRICS coins and see if they can actually get gold. You could do that, but in this day and age, no country wants to have a strong currency because that would hit exports. We saw that there in the wake of the 2008 crisis. The Swiss franc started soaring. Right? There were all these, that was around 2012-13 with the European debt crisis. All of these Europeans were piling the Swiss franc. The Swiss franc is only so big, so the franc skyrocketed. And so the Swiss central bank panicked and they just started printing the stuff. I mean, just like as fast as the confetti printers could go. So that's Switzerland. Switzerland is like the most responsible monetary country on earth. So nobody wants a strong currency.
So the answer is no, you do not see
It won't be Euro style, but I think what is absolutely possible and would sort of give China, it would make its dreams come true, is that external gold-backed rail. So that would, from China's perspective, that would precisely replicate what the dollar is for them, right? A dollar is an external rail for them. They don't use it at home. They only use it for trade.
What do you mean by an external gold-backed rail?
Right. So that would be the way that it would look. It wouldn't be a national currency. Okay, it would be like a BRICS currency, and there might be some sort of establishing bank that would hold gold, and you could take those brick pieces of paper and you could go and actually trade it for gold. So it would look like what the dollar used to be before Nixon screwed it.
So not using it in their domestic situations.
Bingo, exactly.
Still using it on the global stage.
Exactly.
And still moving away from the dollar.
Right, because that gives them what they want. What they really want is to knock out the dollar as a trade rail.
So it sounds like you're saying that this is still a possibility.
For sure, for sure. I think it's absolutely a possibility. It's just that I think a lot of the discussion around BRICS, when people say things like, no, it's impossible because the countries don't like each other, that's not the point. They're not going to be
So they'll keep their own currencies.
Exactly.
They'll keep whatever arrangements that they have, but will create
this external rail.
Right.
Yes.
Is Bitcoin an option for the BRICS as they look to move away from the dollar and all of these other countries that we've just mentioned that are concerned after the weaponization of the dollar and aren't diversifying? Are any of them looking at Bitcoin, do you think?
None of them are, but they should be. I think at that point, we really get into sort of the mental limitations of the central bankers of the world. You know, gold has been the underpinning of the financial system in living memory. So, you know, it was only, 50-some years ago that Nixon broke it. So I think that if we do have, for example, a BRICS currency, or alternatively, if the West screws it up and, you know, some country decides to go back to asset-backed currencies, I think almost certainly it's going to be gold, just because we have the familiarity. Pretty much, you know, somebody over the age of 50 is pretty rare that they'll understand Bitcoin, right? And the people who run the world, the people who run Wall Street, who run central banks, these people are generally over 50. So I think if bad times hit, or if BRICS gets its act together, then I think most likely they will start with some sort of gold-backed rail. And then at that point, you know, we sort of stay in the same world we are now, right? If you look at the gold community in the world right now, I think anybody above the age of 50, let's say, that's my age, so I feel like I'm not insulting people if I go with 50, that anybody over the age of 50, I think, generally tends to be a gold bug. Anybody in our hard money world who's below 50 tends to be Bitcoin. And I think that...
You can be both, but yeah, I get the generalization.
There are an increasing number who are both. And so, you know, if we go to that sort of gold-backed world, then I think we just sort of continue where we are now, probably at an accelerated pace because fiat is no longer a contender. And I would imagine that several decades later, as more and more people understand Bitcoin and are familiar with it, that we would switch over to Bitcoin. But I think in the near term, if we have either, you know, BRICS pushing it, or if we have some kind of currency crisis in the near term, like the next 10 years, I think absolutely they're just going to go to gold. They just don't understand Bitcoin.
Okay, so gold is going to be the route for the external rail of the BRICS Plus
if they can get their act together.
If they can get their act together.
And a big part of that was China, right? So China's really been the leading force on this. China's been the most motivated to knock the US out. And China's, of course, now distracted. They've gone and screwed up their economy. So China may sit out the next couple of rounds here while they kind of tend to their wounds.
All right, I want to end off on a potentially grim warning, a sober note from you, but something that you said we have to highlight because things can still be done.
Yes.
And in your recent newsletter, you explore the idea of the fourth turning, which refers to a civilization crisis, taking into account this theory that history happens in cycles, and we're at the point of the cycle where we're overdue a big civilization crisis. Expand on that.
Yeah, so that's well known, I think, in our communities from the fourth turning concept, which is this idea that history kind of progresses in these 80-year cycles. They each have, you know, 20-year chunks. It's best known really on the internet as the, weak times make hard men, strong men make good times. And that's actually based on about a 2,200-year-old discussion from ancient Greece. Polybius was the most famous version of that. And
it goes, strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men create good times, and so the cycle goes. For those not familiar with the meme.
Yes, that's exactly it. And the idea is that essentially when you have a crisis, it takes a certain, this is 2023, so a certain type of person to bring society back up. That then creates prosperity, it creates good times. The problem is that the prosperity itself creates people who are complacent. Things are good. We don't have to worry about it. And they fail to defend the key institutions. So the educational system, the media, the government itself, the bureaucracy, the civil service, they don't defend these things. And so they sort of gradually erode. And over time, that starts to gunk up to the point where the machine stops. Then you get this crisis, and then it repeats. And I think without a doubt, if we look through history, that's essentially guaranteed. That's how all golden ages have ended, but the current one that we're coming down from. And they essentially all end the same way, which is that pattern. In the newsletter, I talked about the fourth turning just because I guess I have a caveat on that theory, which is that the fourth turning idea, it sort of lays it out as these really clean 20-year cycles. And I think that's not true. In fact, if it were, then we could just be complacent. We just kick back, maybe go hide on an island somewhere for a couple of years, because 2026, according to the model, is when everything's going to be great again. I wish it were that way, but I don't think it is. I think if you actually look back through history, the bad times can last centuries, such as in China. The good times can also last centuries, such as the British Empire. So I think that it is very much under our control. Many times in history, we have stopped the cycle. It's been reversed many, many times. Even in American history, it's very short. It's 200 odd years. And even during that, after the aftermath of the Civil War, a lot of people thought America was just completely done. The Constitution had been shredded. Half the country was completely flattened. We had hyperinflation in the greenbacks. Of course, the war was worth it for what it achieved, but there were many people who thought that that was really the end of the American experiment. And 10 years later, we had the golden age of American history, the so-called Gilded Age. Right? Gilded means it's covered in gold, but it's not really. That was what the socialists called it. The real name for it is Golden Age. From about 1870 to about 1910, almost everything that we use today was invented. Literally everything in this room was invented in that small period. We've been running on fumes. So the moral of the story for me is that, yes, we're in a dangerous time. History has told us that there is this cycle, and we need to be very, very aware of it, because I think all of us can agree when we look around, there are a lot of very, very concerning trends. But the key here is that it is under our control. Even if elections are fortified, even if the powerful have a bigger say, that's always been the case in history. It's not great, but that's how it works, and we have a chance.
What do you see as this crisis, though?
I think it's precisely that people fail to defend the institutions. It's different in every country. If I take the American example, specifically what they failed to defend was the government bureaucracy. And so if we sort of put a red date on it, ironically enough, it was probably 1873, the Pendleton Act, that set the bureaucracy independent from the people. Okay, previous to then, when every new president came in, they could fire the whole lot of them, which meant that the presidents actually, or the bureaucrats in the government actually worked for the president. So Andrew Jackson famously fired a big chunk, maybe 10 or 20% of the federal workers, and the rest of them straightened out, and they were Jackson's men. But after that, once you got that independence, and it's largely been replicated in every single country, allegedly to reduce corruption or to make the civil service more professional. Okay, yeah. But what that ends up doing is that it's like a cancer. Okay, the bureaucracy metastasizes and it grows its own goals in life, and those have nothing to do with the people, because it's impossible to fire them.
But in terms of the fourth turning crisis, right? Because the adjectives to describe that, an era of destruction that can involve war, revolution, or societal collapse, I mean, that's a pretty big crisis hitting. So what do you envision that crisis being?
Just to finish the thought on the bureaucratization, once you get to that point, you start creating all of these things now, like the Federal Reserve, the wars, which are, people sort of look around and they say, why do we have this war? Well, because the bureaucracy wants it, okay? We have these independent forces now. And so to answer your question, what the crisis is going to look like, I think has a lot to do with what that deep state, if you like, but there's a sort of union between various activists, various lobbyists, and the government itself. They tend to agree with each other quite a bit. And so I could see them launching I mean, really continuing what they've been doing, which is taking more power away from the people. This has been shifting our economy in general towards one where the government and its lobbyists have much more say over what the economy looks like, right? We see this very dramatically in energy, where we have a very, very good energy source available to us, fossil fuels, and we are essentially abandoning those in favor of unicorn farts, just these sort of pipe dreams. And why? Because that deep state, if you like, whatever you want to call it, because they're in favor of that. And so my concern is that as that goes forward, we sort of move towards the Soviet model, where fundamentally the government is the one who's deciding how innovation is going to go, what is the economy going to look like. Governments historically are very, very bad at that. They pick the wrong tech, especially if as in our system, if you have corruption in there, then they're almost certainly going to pick the wrong tech. They're going to pick it based on who their donors are and what their donors are interested. So I think that what that sort of sums up to regular people is that it starts to look like stagflation. So you have enormous amounts of money being printed that is keeping inflation going, but then on the other hand, you have this sort of permissioned economy where governments are the one deciding what gets done, and that is draining resources. Specifically, it's bidding resources away from the productive economy, and that what we end up getting out of that is really this stagflation, almost Soviet outcome.
Which is bad.
For sure.
But not as bad as other potential crises points, like, for example, the Great Reset, right? Which does involve tremendous government overreach. In order to get us there. I mean, we've got people saying that we could get the Great Reset, a one world government, a one world currency, 15-minute cities. Okay, again, these are conspiracy theories, but a lot of this is actually laid out in the agenda of the World Economic Forum. They actually say that they want to do this. The whole idea, you will own nothing and be happy.
Exactly.
And that links, of course, back to central bank digital currencies and CBDCs. Is this perhaps the crisis that's looming?
Without a doubt, yeah. I think that's exactly that, whatever we call it, deep state, whatever.
Establishment,
the elite, whatever term we want to use. Yeah, I think absolutely. And what really concerned me about what happened during COVID is that I think the elite have been holding back because they imagined that people would resist. And I think all of them were deeply surprised at how little resistance there was during COVID. And I think it gave them a lot of exciting ideas. And so, we're seeing in Britain with the 15-minute cities, we're seeing the CBDCs, which have no congressional authorization, at least not in the US, and yet they're pushing them as fast as they can. I think that's exactly what we're headed towards, is a controlled economy where we are impoverished very quickly, where our liberties are taken away whenever some donor or some activist came up with the idea.
I mean, we saw during COVID tremendous government overreach to levels we didn't even
It's astounding.
Were possible in democracies.
You're absolutely right. Closing churches has been unthinkable since 1648. Okay, that question was settled a very long time ago. I was absolutely shocked to see that. Governments have not been able to do that sort of thing for a long time, and people did not do anything about it.
Yeah, which leads me to the next point. And that is, what can people do about it? Because for me, I think it all hinges quite dramatically on a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, because through that, government is able to enforce so much power. Once everybody is hooked on that system, the government can just cut you off the system. And so you will have to play nicely in order to remain a viable member of society and the economy. I mean, we've seen people being debanked. We saw that with the truckers in Canada when they were protesting against the vaccine. They were taken off the banking system. So when you have a CBDC, it's so much easier to make that, to exercise that control. And as you said, it's still being formulated over 120 countries are actively working on a CBDC.
They're all working on it. They love it.
There is a little bit of pushback in the US coming from Republicans saying at the very least you're going to need Congress to vote on this. We'll see how that plays out. But back to the idea of people being complacent, right? What can people do to push back against this fourth turning?
Yeah, I think there's really two things. The first is to keep in mind that compared to most of history, I know elections are not 100% fair. They're not anywhere remotely close to 100% fair. But compared to history, we have much, much more power than people ever had in previous generations. The ability to communicate on the internet, to get your ideas out, to have these kinds of conversations. In previous eras, I would not be speaking out loud.
You could still be canceled in this era. I mean, depending on what you say and what format you have. I mean, you could argue that sometimes when people are outspoken, let's throw out Russell Brand, for example, and that people come up with charges against him. I'm not saying that the charges are invalid. We don't know. But
he got a lot more scrutiny once he started talking about things.
Let's just say that when people gain too big a platform, sometimes there are ways are found in order to silence them.
Without a doubt. But
to your point, we do still have a greater stage than ever before. People still get canceled, but we still have a greater stage to get out opinions and thoughts than we've ever had before when everything was controlled by the mainstream media. We do have platforms that allow for contrarian thinking.
Right, absolutely. You know, Murray Rothbard talked about in the 1970s, he would get together the Liberty Movement and they could fit in a living room because there was no way to get your ideas out. You literally had to like run into people one by one. Right? And if we compare that today, even at the height of the censorship, we were still getting our word out. We had to be cute about things. We had to use different phrasings. It was difficult. It was very annoying. It was not something that I think any of us thought that we'd have to put up with. But compared to previous generations, we have a lot more tools than we ever had. And beyond that, we also have elections, right? In most periods of human history, there's been nothing remotely looking like an election. I know they're unfair. But the thing is, there's this interesting pattern. So governments cheat on elections so that they can ignore the other side's voters, right? But something interesting happens, and this is across any country. Once they can ignore the other side's voters, they can also ignore their own voters. And every political party is a permanent battle, I'm trying to use clean words, is a permanent battle between its voters, its base, and the activists or the professional politicians. All right, Republicans complain about the rhinos, Democrats complain about the establishment. This is always the case. Every political party, they're trying to get away with anything they can, and the base is constantly coming at them and saying, stick to the job you told me you would do, okay? So what happens when somebody starts stealing elections, first they ignore the other side and they have a really good run for like 2-3 elections. They're just slaughtering it. They're killing it. Everybody loves us. After that, they go crazy. They start getting into, we won't talk about what they are because we would touch on censored topics, I suppose. But at any rate, they just go off the deep end. They believe crazy things about biology and all kinds of stuff. That is exactly what we're seeing at this point. So the saving grace is that as long as we have some semblance of elections, I'll give you an example in Hong Kong a couple years ago. So traditionally, Hong Kong had elections for the Legislative Council. And the elections were pretty closely fought. You had the pro-China gang and you had the pro-democracy gang. And then China started their crackdown. And they had one last legislative election before they shut the whole thing down. They had one last one. And I don't remember the numbers. It was like 90%. It was more than 90%. It was just overwhelming. Everybody in Hong Kong, even all the people who had been pro-China all those years, they were like, this is insane. No.
Okay, so elections, votes.
Yes.
Is that our primary weapon?
In practice, elections, but more important than that is organizing.
Awareness,
Certainly all countries around the West, and I mean, not just the kinds of things that we do, which is trying to reach out to people and sort of connect dots for people who aren't awake yet, but sort of on like the neighborhood level. People dramatically underestimate how easy it is. School boards, town councils, these things are wide open. The people who do them, it's part-time, they get a day job, they don't really care that much. All these crazy people, they generally go with the crazy because it's the path of least resistance. You've got some activist who calls them at home every week and yells at them about something or other and say, okay, fine, I'll do the crazy thing. These are wide open. And we saw that recently with school boards that has become politicized in the US. A lot of people are now organizing on the non-woke side to try to get those seats. It's amazing. They're wide open. And what gives me hope is that every time they do something crazy, you'll see the mainstream media all love it. Like, for example, take movies. Okay, they'll come out with this stupid woke movie, and all of the film critics will say it's the best thing I've ever seen. This is astounding. Academy Awards. And then you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score, where everybody hates this stuff. Mm-hmm. The people are with us. They do not like what the elite are doing. They're silenced, but I would much rather be on the side of the people than this.
Well, you could also argue that they're vocalizing their opinions through their pocketbooks. We've seen,
like, we've started seeing that, exactly.
If we talk about like the Bud Light situation.
For sure.
Okay, so as we wrap up here, use the system to fight against the system. Use the tools available to you within the system to fight against the system.
Yes, we still have those tools. We have to use them.
All right. Thank you so much. Hopefully the fourth turning is not inevitable. We covered a lot of ground. Really enjoyed this conversation. Peter St Onge, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure.
All right. And as always, thank you for watching. For me, Michelle Makori, and the rest of the Kitco team, we'll see you next time.
This is Kitco News special coverage of the Pacific Bitcoin Festival in Los Angeles, California.